Hello, my name is Tito Flores-Bautista, and my topic is language variation during COVID-19. Um, I did this in collaboration with the Ducks Rice Research Fellowship as I am part of the cohort. And my faculty mentor was Kelly Howard. Um, this is based off the interest from my major, which is Spanish. So there's variation of the Spanish language. As you see from the map, there's from Europe with Spain, but also Latin and Southern America, and United States also is considered as a prominent um, population that speaks Spanish. But it's, as you can see, there's great distance between geographically between all these countries and regions, which means there is going to be variations of the language because there's different um, sources of influence, whether it's other languages um, like French, English, or also native languages also affect the variations of Spanish because of like préstamos and just the different reasons how languages influence by region. For an example of mine of language variation is in my classes in UO, I had an assignment, or the class had an assignment to showcase a recipe they use in their family. And I kept hearing people say crema de maní or mantequilla de maní. And I was kind of like, oh, what is that? I wonder what that is. But I was too scared to ask, like, oh, what does that mean? One of the ingredients of like came up over and over on the showcase of recipes. And then for a moment, I thought it was just butter, like mantequilla, so butter. Maybe it's just a different way to say it, but ended up not being butter. After class, I searched it up on Google or Word reference, and it came out saying that mantequilla de maní or crema de maní was peanut butter, not just butter. So, because when I learned Spanish, um, I knew it as crema de cacahuate, which I later learned through my research that it was influenced more on the native language of the Mexican region from the past. So mostly people who use crema de cacahuate are from descendants or speakers from influence from Mexican variation. So I learned that there is different ways of language variation, even in the common day-to-day. Also, another example is the word ahorita. Depending on the region of the speaker, ahorita can mean like right now, later, or another day. So there's variations of examples of in Spanish. So in March 2020, COVID-19 became a bigger awareness of it. A lot more cases came around the United States. It was a respiratory disease. It really did affect people's lives. It created this remote learning, isolation from everyone else, family members, friends. So, and a lot of people were using social media. So, but also it led to more communication of information about the virus to be centralized in a certain way to just get the sources from the government or like health agencies. So, as I mentioned before, new infectious disease equals necessity of public announcements. So agencies like World Health Organization early on, like in January, February, became a prominent name of 2020. So had constant press conferences about it. So it really created this awareness as it got closer to March. And as it got closer to March, CDC and the national governments all over the world needed to communicate the information. So, and I found for my research in this case, I said, okay, well, maybe I want to research more uh, something about language variation. And I thought maybe COVID-19, the topic of it, might be a perfect example or curious example to see, is there language variation when it comes to medical terminology, scientific terminology, the way people, the governments, agencies explain the the situation and like the new updates about the virus, health measures. So I was like, okay, well, this seems interesting. So did this, and then CDC had a Spanish version of Twitter, and then the Secretaría de Salud de Mexico had their own also. And I was like, okay, well, maybe I can compare see the language variation between Mexico's Spanish publications and the ones in the US. And primary curiosity is that um, the US has a lot of influence from not just Spanish speakers from Mexico, but from other regions of Latin America. And so I was like, oh, I wonder if they use the same or is there similarity? And because it can really lead to depending on how they communicate um, the messages of health measures, health, it can affect the way people receive or perceive um, the measures. Because ahorita, if they use it, that can mean, depending on the region, like the example I gave, I mean, totally different. So the message and that the government or a health agency wants to indicate might not be actually. So I was like, maybe I can do that. So the methodology I used was I went on to Google and I put the site Twitter CDC Español and then site Twitter /salud _MX COVID or COVID virus. And I made the tools to be between March 1st to March 30th. And I did this because I want to see how it was, do a 1 month period, because having 2 months or more, it was going to be more too wide. And I wanted to see how the message was being sent out to the public within like the beginning. So I think March, the first month of March was a good time frame. And yeah, so I ended up picking Twitter because when I first doing my research, I saw that looks from Facebook or other social medias or like even their own websites, they kept spreading the same infographics or public announcements. So I was like, okay, well, I'm just gonna focus on Twitter, and either way, they recycle their own publications. So I was like, oh, I'll just do Twitter and does it, period. And as I mentioned before, I really wanted to check, was there language variation when it came to as a topic of scientific or health? And I ended up finding that there wasn't as much language variation after doing the research. There was like small differences, which I'll show you right now. So when it came to the beginning, was a lot about washing hands or like making sure you were clean. And la Secretaría de Salud de Mexico used frotar palmas, but the CDC used restega. So the same action but different terminology being used. So an example of language variation. Also, when it came to when you have symptoms and making sure there's like social distancing or making sure isolation, The Secretaría de Salud de México used resguardo en casa, and CDC used distanciamiento social, which is another example. And then for pon el alto was another, was like put a stop to the virus or the spread of the virus. And los Secretaría de México poner un alto, and CDC used detener la propagación. So there's small variations of how they used it. So it really was just interesting how overall when I was using all the data, pretty much it was the same terminology. I'm not sure if it was because of the first month. Maybe everyone was using uniformly the same variation or the same way of communication because it was so early on. I'm not sure, but really this was interesting of how, and also the amounts of posts weren't as much. I think there was a lot of later on to how there was evolution, especially throughout like the summer of 2020. There was a lot more information that was being developed. The post, both agencies kept reposting the same publications over and over and over, and within that time frame. But one interesting thing I found, which is I didn't see necessarily an equivalent in Spanish in English, but or like the CDC, the US, was Secretaría de Salud por estornudo etiqueta, which was really interesting to me because I've never heard that in the US, like the translation would be like sneezing with etiquette, which I've never heard, or estornudo etiqueta either in Spanish or in English. So it was pretty interesting when I was researching and gathering all the data of like the examples and possible variations. So, and other findings that I was able to find was how the Secretaría de Salud de Mexico, the first month, said it was not necessary to use a face mask or face covering, which was, I think in the US also in the beginning, like end of February, end of March, there's also kind of like, oh, you don't have to wear a mask. So I think it was along the month of March, Mexico's health government or health agency said, "Oh no, you don't need to use masks. It's just using washing your hands, disinfecting your areas." And also they talked about misinformation as like no difundas rumores ni información falsa in their publications. So it really was interesting how to reflect, go back 2 years and see how the evolution was, because a couple months later it was like, oh no, you have to use a mask to be for protection of stopping the virus, the spread of the virus. And it was just really interesting to see how the evolution of it. Obviously these are just possible findings. I can possibly do more research later on. So maybe to see how did the health measures evolved throughout time. And then another thing was rapid tests. So in the beginning of March, there was no rapid tests, but now looking forward to 2022, 2023, there is rapid tests. You can get go to a doctor or a health center and get a test in like 15 minutes. But as you see in March 2020, there were no rapid tests. So it was another finding, maybe a possible research later on of when was it? How did it evolutionize? What was how accessible was the rapid test for the public? So another topic of research in the future, possible. And also OHA communications, because of time frame and time restrictions, and just I wasn't able to do more about OHA research. But something that seemed interesting was how they actually didn't have their Spanish website or like publications, social media up until April. So as you can see here, it was April 16 was when they opened their publications, and they only had Facebook. So they didn't use Twitter or they didn't use any other social media like Instagram. They used the way they communicated. Oregon Health Agency communicated with the Spanish speaking population was through Facebook, which is really interesting. As a Spanish speaker or a family with it, I would say that a lot of more Spanish speakers do gravitate more towards Facebook. So it was really interesting to look back and research and say, oh yeah, it was a good um, something I noticed that was pretty good. So maybe a possible research topic of saying like the influence or the usage of Facebook within the Spanish speaking community in the United States, or in specifically Oregon in general, would be possible, and how it has evolutionized throughout the pandemic. And that's it for my project. It was really interesting to learn um, more about looking back, reflecting, seeing the language variation. Now, there was actually pretty uniformly, more or less, the same variations, specifically, obviously, in the first month. Thank you, and hope you enjoyed this presentation.